How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Dan Morley Boxing Podcast. I am in the new studio here in the podcast room in Barnes. They've done it up. It's got the logo in the back. And yeah, today I'm going to crack on, just me today. But today's episode, I want to delve into, it's something I'm actually doing on Instagram right now. I want to delve into the greatest achievements ever in boxing history. It's something that there have been so many amazing achievements in the sport. Like throughout, in recent years, in the old school days, they never get mentioned enough. And I think that there's a lot of newer fans that, this is a bit of a throwaway comment, but they feel like boxing, if it didn't happen after 1990, it doesn't matter. But here I've picked up loads and loads of the greatest achievements ever. They're just mind-blowing. You can't get your head around them. And I'm going to go through as many as I can. I've got about 15 to 20 that I want to cover. If I can get through 15, that would be perfect. But in my opinion, these are just the most mind-blowing feats ever achieved in boxing. It's a whole different array of accolades, achievements, accomplishments. So I am just going to get straight into it. But before I get straight into that, I want to give a shout out to my sponsors, Henderson Plastering and Rendering and RT Painting, who always support the channel, always support my career and make this possible. So please get over, give them a follow. Their details will be in the bio, so make sure you show them some love because they really do help me out. And without further ado, let's get started. Now, I'm going to start with Wilfred Bonitz becoming the youngest world champion in boxing history. This is an achievement that will never be done again because, especially in this country, it isn't even legal to box at this age. Wilfred Bonitz was arguably the fifth king, unofficially, to Hagler, Hearns, Duran, and Leonard, although he never boxed Hagler. He was a defensive genius, incredibly slick, probably, up there amongst the greatest Puerto Rican boxers ever. And he won the world title, the junior lightweight world title, at 17 years old, which when you really think about that, it's mind-blowing. 17 years old, fighting 15 rounders against world-level opposition. But it's the opposition that makes that achievement even more impressive because he didn't just beat a regular title holder. You get nowadays, you can get titles quite easily. This was in the 1970s where champions were high quality. And he beat Antonio Cervantes for that title. Antonio Cervantes is a Hall of Famer. He had 19 world title fights, and going into that fight against Benitez, had successfully retained the title 10 times, beating legendary fighters like Nicolino Loche and Esteban de Jesus. Benitez winning that title at 17 and putting on a brilliant performance, showing skill, slickness, defensive craft, ring IQ, well above his years, well beyond his years, is unmatchable, and it will never be matched. It'll never, ever be matched. No one will ever win a world title at 17 again, even 18. And then when you look at what he actually went on to do, by the time he was 23, 24, he'd already boxed Leonard. He'd already beaten Duran. He was a 3-division champion and also boxed Tommy Hearns. Unfortunately, he did go on to fade in his mid-20s, and he took a lot of punishing losses, and sadly, he is in a bad way now. Maybe because he was fighting against grown men so young, but to be a world champion at 17, it's never been matched, and it will never be surpassed. Which then takes me to one of the more modern ones, and it's Manny Pacquiao going across 8 different weight divisions, winning world titles. Now, in the modern era, and I say the modern era because that's important in the context, because I'm going to get to some of the old school guys that jumped weight classes, and then you'll realise how freakish some of these guys are. But in the modern era, that's unprecedented. No one's even come close. I think De La Hoya was a 6-weight world champion, which is 2 divisions off. But what makes Pacquiao's run so much more impressive is that he actually skipped 2 divisions in those 8 divisions where he won the titles. So he went from flyweight to super welterweight, which is 10 different weight divisions. No one in boxing in the modern era in the last 50, 60, 70 years has come close to boxing across 10 different weight divisions. The old school guys have. I'll get to them later, but it is unprecedented. Now, people will make the accusations about Pacquiao, how he was able to do it, but he was never, ever proven. Those were never proven. And when you look at the quality of the people he was fighting, You know, you got, obviously, he won his first title in Asia, the flyweight title, and then Lelo Ledwaba, where he really burst onto the scene. But those amazing wars against Marco Antonio Barrera, Eric Morales, Juan Manuel Marquez, you know, the fights against Ricky Hatton, Miguel Cotto, Antonio Margarito, who was a giant junior welterweight. He wasn't even super welterweight. He wasn't even, a small super welterweight. He was one of the bigger ones. It's absolutely unbelievable. You got Oscar De La Hoya in there as well. So many great fighters. To be an 8-division champion, I don't know whether we'll ever see someone do that again. To put it into context of how amazing that is, Naoya Inoue is a 4-division champion. If he wanted to be an 8-division champion, I believe he'd have to go up to junior welterweight, which is just, it would be like boxing Teofimo Lopez. It's just unfathomable right now. So Pacquiao winning titles across 8 different weight divisions it's simply unbelievable in the modern era. But the reason I say the modern era is because there have been fighters that have done it. You have Mickey Walker, who famously was the welterweight and middleweight champion, boxed the great Harry Greb, who would ultimately end up fighting Max Schmeling, the heavyweight, and he was so good around the 1920s that he was an actual heavyweight contender. You have Georges Carpentier, who boxed from reportedly flyweight to heavyweight, and like not just boxing your run-of-the-mill heavyweights, boxing Jack Dempsey for the title in boxing's first $1 million gate fight at heavyweight. I mean, that is literally every weight division in the sport. There are quite a few fighters that have jumped weight divisions freakishly, but for me, the most impressive one is Sam Langford's run from lightweight to heavyweight. Sam Langford was a top 5 all-time great. He had amongst the highest wins against Hall of Famers in history. He boxed everyone of note from lightweight to heavyweight. Everyone that would fight him, I should say, because he was so heavily avoided because he had over 100 knockouts, one of the hardest punchers in history. But when you dig into the level of opposition he was beating through the weight divisions, it's greatest resume of all time stuff. And it makes today's fights pale in comparison. So as a teenager, at lightweight, he boxed the great Joe Gans. Now, to put it into context, Joe Gans was considered the greatest lightweight ever at the time. He was revolutionary. Even over a century later, the tricks that he was pulling off are still used by today's fighters. Langford will go and beat Gans. But I can't remember exactly the reason why the title wasn't on the line, but he beat Joe Gans as a teenager. He would then go and fight Barbados Joe Walcott, who was the welterweight champion, and I believe this was for the title. But unfortunately, he would get a draw in a fight that many thought he clearly won. Barbados Joe Walcott is the original Joe Walcott. You also had Jersey Joe Walcott as well. But all these, over a century later, again, still considered and still named amongst the top welterweights of all time. Obviously, it's revolutionised, it's evolved. But at the time, he was the greatest welterweight ever. Langford would then beat young Peter Jackson, who was the man who took the title from Walcott. So he's beat the greatest lightweight ever at the time and the greatest welterweight ever at the time and beaten the man who beat the great welterweight. That wasn't enough. He would go up to middleweight, where he would defeat another contender for the greatest middleweight of all time in Stanley Ketchel, a man who had floored Jack Johnson. He absolutely slaughtered him over a 6-round fight. And later in his career, he would beat the great middleweight champion Tiger Flowers. Langford would defeat Tiger Flowers, a man who had beaten Harry Greb. Then you have his light heavyweight run, where he beat the light heavyweight champion, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. And then you have his heavyweight fights, where even as a youngster, he moved all the way up from lightweight to welterweight to heavyweight to face Jack Johnson, arguably one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Then you had his fights against Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, who, and it's important to bring this up, were black heavyweights because due to the racial, tension at the time, lots of black fighters never got their opportunity to get title shots. So these guys were Hall of Fame level, but they never got the opportunity to do so. So they all fought each other. And being a former lightweight, I believe Langford boxed Harry Wills around 20 times. He boxed those fighters collectively around 40 times, and he knocked them all out multiple times. It's an unbelievable run. It's legendary stuff that's never, ever been mimicked or No one's ever come close to it. The great Harry Greb went from beating all the welterweights to heavyweights, but going from lightweights to heavyweights is just ridiculous. So Sam Langford's run, where they, I think he had officially close to 300 fights and over 120 knockouts, but unofficially, because he had to travel a lot around Europe because he was so avoided, they reckon he might have had up to 600 fights. It's an unbelievable story. Just jumping weight divisions for fun, making the top heavyweights avoid him. Jack Dempsey actively avoided Sam Langford. So you have the most ferocious heavyweight of the 1920s and one of the most fearsome heavyweights ever avoiding a lightweight. That's the level of Sam Langford. And that run is absolutely extraordinary. And one of the things you'll notice about that run is how often Sam Langford fought. Guys like Harry Greb, Sam Langford, Jack Britton, Ted Kid Lewis, they're having 300 fights. But the next guy absolutely blows those numbers out the water. And it's Len Wick, who holds the record for the most professional fights and professional wins in boxing history. Len Wick was born in England. He was born in Leicester. He had 473 professional fights, and he boxed mainly through the 30s. He won 340 of those, had 87 losses and 42 draws with 93 knockouts. The numbers are absolutely ridiculous. He, and the thing is, he had a 19-year career because he retired just, I believe, in the late 40s. But in that 19-year career, I believe 470 of those fights came in the first 12 years because 6 years of his career, he had to be inactive due to World War II. So he was pushing on, if he was going to maintain that activity before he had to take the break, to nearly 700 to 800 pro fights. Many of his fights went over 10 rounds. He boxed over 4,000 rounds in his career. It's ridiculous. He had 3 years where he boxed over 50 times and 5 years where he boxed over 40 times. The most active fighter in history. Again, another record that will never be broken. Unofficially, there may be fighters that had more, maybe Jimmy Wilde or Sam Langford, who are reported to have maybe 700 fights, but officially, don't have as many on the record. But Len Wick officially has all of those fights. You can check it on BoxRec, you can check it on Wikipedia. Most of them were 10-rounders, over 4,000 rounds in his career. Absolutely unbelievable. And there's a fight available. I think you can get it on YouTube against Eric Boone. And he wasn't no defensive fighter either. He kind of shaped up a little bit like Froch. I saw someone comment on a post I put about it. And he was taking a lot of shots. So to do that 473 times. And he was probably serving in the war in between as well. So he was probably fighting in between. Unbelievable. And staying on the subject of a lot of fights, the next one I'm going to jump into the amateurs. Now, when you see some of these crazy professional records, it absolutely blows you away. So, Willie Pep losing once in 136 fights or something, and surviving a plane crash in the middle throughout the 1940s, where he was featherweight champion for most of it. Sugar Ray Robinson losing just once in his first 132 fights, welterweight and middleweight champion in the middle of it. And this is what I mean, when I don't want to detour too much, but when people talk about, those old guys wouldn't compare to the new fighters. These guys are fighting 10, 15 rounds at a volume like this, fighting 3-4 times a month, 15 rounds, going 134 to 1, beating Hall of Famers. Perhaps the training, all of the science and the training methods are a lot more modernized now. Fighters are sharper, they're fitter, but, it's all relative. Back there, it's not like they had the modern training technology that fighters have now. It was all the same. So to go out and beat all of those Hall of Famers who are great fighters and they all have access to the same equipment, the same science, the same knowledge, it's unbelievable how dominant these fighters were. Sugar Ray Robinson going 129-1, Willie Pep 135-1 as a pro in the 40s. Unbelievable. Harry Greb going 120-1 with a couple of draws in his peak. Unbelievable. But going back to my amateur point, which is the point and the achievement I want to touch upon here, it's Vasyl Lomachenko's amateur record, which I still can't get my head around the numbers. When you hear it and it makes your mind, it makes your jaw just drop. But when you actually think about how many fights that is and how the win streak is unbelievable, Vasyl Lomachenko went 396 wins to 1 defeat as an amateur. Like, just let that sink in. If you were to go on Fight Night Champion or something, like one of those video games, and if you were going to compile 400 amateur fights, 3-round fights on there, it would take you months to actually go and do that in real life, travel all around the world, to, have all of those fights, and to lose just once it's insane. You can't comprehend it. And, he was fighting at an extremely high level. He only lost to Albert Selimov, a man who he would ironically beat 2 more times. So he beat everyone he fought as an amateur. He was a 2-time Olympic gold medalist, won the Europeans, won the Worlds. He won everything multiple times. And one of the most impressive things about Lomachenko, and it's one most people don't ever touch upon, because you have the admirers that, really appreciate the fact that he took that risk fighting Salido in just his second pro fight. And then you have his, I'm not going to say haters, but the people that will give him stick for getting an opportunity in his second fight. But what most don't know is he actually boxed in the World Boxing Series, or the World Series of Boxing, in between his amateur and his professional debut. So he had his amateur fights, which are 3-rounders, and then he had his pro fights. But in between there, he was boxing, I believe he boxed 7 times. And I believe these were 6 3-minute rounds, almost like a pro format. And, it was against very, very top amateurs with a professional format. No headgear, no vest. So some people even say they should count towards his professional fights. Almost like having, he obviously had his first pro fight and went straight into the title fight, whereas most fighters will build themselves up. Some people claim that these kind of acted in a sense for him to get professional experience, the longer rounds. So yeah, and you get the people that say, oh, he didn't deserve that title shot, he went straight from amateurs. He actually didn't. He had about 6 3-minute round fights in between without the headgear. But 396-1 as an amateur is just an absolute joke. I think my record as an amateur was 18 wins to 8 losses. And that's pretty good because I boxed a fairly decent level. I boxed quite a few national champions. And when I think about how long it would take me to have 397 fights and to lose just once, it's unbelievable. One of the greatest ever records compiled. And I have to give a shout out as well to Don Curry, who I believe his record as an amateur was 400 wins to 4 losses, which is similarly to Lomachenko, just unbelievable. There's a lot of great amateurs. I did a list on them a while ago, and some of the numbers are just astronomical. Gennady Golovkin, 345 to 5 as an amateur. Usyk had about 15 losses in 300 fights. It's a joke. But going back to the professional game now, and I'm going to go into a more modern one. And there are 3 fighters that have achieved this so far. Only 2 that have done it in the 4-belt era. And it's becoming a 2-division undisputed champion. And I think it's phenomenal what Inoue and Crawford have achieved in the recent years. Crawford obviously going undisputed as a light welterweight and a welterweight. And Inoue in the smaller weight divisions as well, bantamweight and super bantamweight. But it's really unbelievable how dominant these 2 guys have been. And it might not be the most unbelievable achievement, going and dominating 2 divisions back to back, but it really does deserve praise. And Evander Holyfield did it too in the 3-belt era, becoming the undisputed cruiserweight champion and the undisputed heavyweight champion. If Alexander Usyk beats Tyson Fury, he will be the 3rd man to do it in the 4-belt era. But I really do like how these guys have gone and chased greatness. Especially Inoue, who is he blitzed out the bantamweight division in the World Boxing Super Series, and it had some really good fighters in there. Rodriguez, Payano, Donaire. Donaire might have been past it, but still a Hall of Famer that in that first fight proved he still had it in him. And of course, Paul Butler, who was a title holder. But then to go up and, within the space of a year, become a 2-division undisputed champion, blasting away Fulton and Tapiles is unbelievable. So those 3 guys becoming 2-division undisputed champions in the modern era is pretty phenomenal. And another one goes back to, it's more modern era, but it goes back to that activity. And I don't see it being beaten anytime soon because fighters just aren't active enough. Now, this isn't an old school one, guys that were fighting 50, times a year, 40, 50 times a year. This is back to like the 80s and the 90s. And it's Julio Cesar Chavez, his record of the most world title fights and the most world title wins in boxing history. Now, of course, you can go back to the old fighters like Sugar Ray Robinson, who, had, I don't know, like, let's say 40, 50 fights against Hall of Famers. Maybe that's a bit exaggerated in that case, but Harry Greb, Sam Langford, those kinds of guys. But officially, there are more titles nowadays. There were more titles when Chavez was active. But to have 37 world title fights across 4 different weight divisions is pretty phenomenal. And you'll always hear people saying, Chavez, he boxed 89 bums when he went 89-0, which is also an amazing feat to put into this as well. During most of those title fights, I believe during that 89-0 streak, he had 27 world title fights. But people say that he boxed, low quality of fighters, which, he did at times, like lots of fighters do. But in that streak, there were just tons and tons of wins against top level operators. Great fighters, great world champions that are just not very well known. Like during those title fights, Chavez beat Roger Mayweather twice, Sammy Fuentes, Rocky Lockridge, Jose Luis Ramirez, a world champion who had over 80 career knockouts, Juan Laporte, a man who went the distance with Salvador Sanchez, Ruben Castillo, great fighters like Meldrick Taylor, Hector Camacho. And then when you go into like the actual fights he lost towards the back end of his career, that are still world title fights. A draw against Pernell Whitaker, Oscar De La Hoya, Kostya Tszyu. It's a fantastic resume to have 37 world title fights against that level of opposition is pretty spectacular. And it always annoys me when people criticize guys like Chavez for fighting, fighters that he's supposed to beat. And Canelo even does it to a certain degree as well. Like, let's say the Avni Yildirim fight, for instance. But like, if these guys are remaining active in a time where people are fighting once every 2 years, in some instances, if these guys are staying active, Canelo with Avni Yildirim, Chavez with, a lot of his fights, if they're staying active around the big fights that they're still having consistently, I don't mind that. I don't mind fighters staying active. You know what I mean? I think, using Canelo's case, for instance, I can't think of a specific year for Chavez off the top of my head, but fighting Avni Yildirim, that was around the time he fought Danny Jacobs, Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders as well. I believe he was trying to box 4 times that year. So I'm all for fighters staying active, fighting people they should beat, as long as they're doing it in an active, in a high activity around the big fights that people are asking for. The rightful challengers are getting their title shots. Boxers are too inactive these days at the top level. And I know that always sounds, like a contradiction coming from me because I haven't boxed for the last 2 years, and that has its own reasons. But I don't mind boxers staying active as long as they're fighting the top operators and top challengers around that at a high activity. So I don't get the criticism there, but people will always criticize. And then next up, I want to move on to some of the older guys. Now, George Foreman winning the heavyweight world title at 45 years old, nearly 46, is pretty unbelievable. It's an amazing feat, and it still holds to this day. Because originally, I believe the oldest world champion was Jersey Joe Walcott, when he knocked out the great Ezard Charles with that legendary uppercut. But for Foreman to do it at nearly 46, considering many people considered his comeback a joke, is pretty amazing. And when you also take into account it was Michael Moore that he knocked out, who was a very, very good fighter, not just your run-of-the-mill title holder, a very good fighter. And it was a knockout, and it wasn't controversial. I think that is one of those, iconic boxing moments. It really is, and it's an amazing achievement. And it's also solidified by the defeats he took in those years. He was coming off that loss to Tommy Morrison, who was a great fighter, a very, very fearsome puncher, someone that would knock you out if you didn't have it, which Big George obviously proved he did. He also had that amazing fight against Evander Holyfield as well, where people really started to take notice and be like, wow, this isn't a gimmick. He is for real. He defeated Jerry Cooney with that amazing walking uppercut like he's strolling in the park. Burt Cooper as well, he beat in that comeback. He also beat Dwight Muhammad Qawi, who I believe was only 5'6". So I think Foreman winning the title at that age is one of the greatest achievements ever. As is Similarly to Wilfred Bonitz being the youngest world champion ever, Bernard Hopkins being the oldest world champion ever is simply unbelievable. Now, I was looking at the great Archie Moore, who, similarly to Hopkins, had that amazing longevity. And I was looking through his record. And when Moore was 40, in his 40s, he was at his best. He was, the light heavyweight champion who was climbing off the canvas 4 times to knock out really, really tough challengers like Yvonne Durrell. But when he was 49, he was boxing the then Cassius Clay, obviously Muhammad Ali, but he was called Clay around that fight before he obviously converted to Islam. And, he was well past it at 49 and he retired very soon after. I believe the Muhammad Ali fight was Moore's second to last one in a 200-plus fight career. But when you compare that longevity, and Moore might be the most iconic fighter to achieve amazing things past a certain age, when you compare that to Hopkins, who actually won a world title at 49, it just goes to show how special Hopkins was. And winning that world title at 49, becoming the oldest world champion in boxing history, is just ridiculous. He obviously won it against Shumanov, who was a Kazakh champion. And he dropped him in the process as well. And just to be in there and then go at 50 years old, go the distance with a prime Sergey Kovalev. Now, Kovalev was a dangerous, dangerous man. Extremely underrated with hindsight. Now, people don't talk about his career as much, but in his prime, he was a killer. And he was knocking everyone out. So for Hopkins at 50 to go the distance with a prime Kovalev and win the title at 49, it's unbelievable. And Hopkins' career after 40 was legendary, considering he'd been a champion for 10 years as a middleweight after a late start. After 40, he boxed Joe Calzaghe, he also boxed Chad Dawson, beat the likes of Jean Pascal, Kelly Pavlik in a schooling, Tavoris Cloud, Buvay Shumanov, went the distance with Kovalev, beat Roy Jones. I believe he had the fights with Jermaine Taylor. His career after 40 was a legendary career. And he had all those years of dominance before. So becoming the oldest world champion ever at 49, after all those years of success, is without a doubt one of the greatest achievements ever in boxing. Which kind of leads me again to the youngest. And it's Mike Tyson winning the world title at 20 years old, which Moses Atuma's trying to break it, but realistically, I don't know if he will, especially when you look at, the level of the title holders now, Fury and Usyk, who are very, very good fighters. But Tyson winning a world title at 20 is just iconic, and I think it will stand the test of time for a very long time, especially at heavyweight, where the top guys are so physically imposing. Tyson as a kid was just freakish. You see the videos of him when he's 14, 15, walking around 200 plus pounds, with the lisp and crying before fights and then going out and sparking people. To win the world title at 20 against Trevor Berbick is one of the most iconic achievements ever. And we also have to give, a big shout out to another one of Cus D'Amato's peekaboo style fighting proteges in Floyd Patterson, who also won the heavyweight title at 20, which obviously Mike beat it. But 2 of Cus's fighters becoming the youngest heavyweight champions ever. It's pretty phenomenal. But the thing I was most impressed about when I looked this up and I looked at the stats is obviously Tyson's prime years, they didn't last too long, but he had such an impact. And I believe he defended that title 5 times within a year, which it might have even been 6, but I believe it was 5. And the level of activity that he had in his prime was really, really good. In the 90s, they were more active than they are now. But to have 6 world title fights, from winning the title to defending it 5 times within the space of 365 days, 12 months, compare that to now where fighters fight once a year, twice a year, once every 2 years at that. It's pretty phenomenal. And I think the devastating knockouts he had consistently in his prime is one of the reasons he stands the test of time and is so iconic. But to be that ferocious, that fierce, and have that much IQ up there, because he was a real historian as well at 20 years old, and to just absolutely terrify fully grown heavyweight veterans, as a kid is unbelievable. And I'm going to move on again because I've got quite a lot to cover here. But I've already mentioned Archie Moore and his amazing longevity. But he was a phenomenal all-time great fighter and, skillful, crafty. But statistically, his power was unbelievable. He had 136 knockouts, which is the most knockouts of any world champion in history. And it's another one of those crazy records that's going to stand the test of time and it's never going to be beaten because no world champion will ever box that many times. The activity is just too low these days. He obviously boxed the likes of Ezard Charles. He lost to Ezard Charles, Charlie Burley, who he also lost to. But he was knocking out guys like Bobo Olsen, Yvonne Durrell multiple times, Harold Johnson, Jimmy Bivens. Some of these guys are Hall of Fame level. To score 136 knockouts and, similarly to Hopkins, who had that long reign and that longevity. Hopkins was middleweight champion for around a decade. Archie Moore was also light heavyweight champion for 10 years, most of it in his mid to late 40s. Phenomenal fighter. He's 136 KOs across his career, will never be beaten. I believe there's one fighter off the top of my head whose name escapes me, who had more knockouts than him. But no world champion has as many knockouts as Archie Moore. And speaking about Archie Moore, I mentioned Ezard Charles, who obviously beat Moore 4 times. And Ezard Charles is the standout amongst this. There's obviously James Toney, Roy Jones Jr., and the great Bob Fitzsimmons. All 3 of those guys won world titles from middleweight to heavyweight. Toney's heavyweight title got stripped because I believe there was something to do with a drug test. But those 3 guys did go and win world title fights from middleweight to heavyweight. Bob Fitzsimmons, in the case of Bob Fitzsimmons, he was the first to do it, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And I believe he was 162 pounds, the lightest heavyweight champion that boxing's ever had. But Ezard Charles' run from middleweight to heavyweight is amongst the most impressive achievements ever. And it never gets mentioned enough. And it's one of the reasons he's a top 10 all-time great, because he was fighting top fighters. He absolutely cleaned out the light heavyweight division for a very long time, but never won the title, never even got a shot at the title, but he beat guys like Charlie Burley, Archie Moore, all of the guys in the Black Murderers Row, which similarly to the Langford case, lots of coloured fighters, black fighters, never got title shots. So although they were great fighters, they were never champions. Charles went and cleared all those guys out, cleared the middleweights, and then moved up to heavyweight and beat Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott, and was on the verge of beating Rocky Marciano. Never gets mentioned anywhere near enough because he did go on far too long. He suffered around 20 losses, 25 losses. But in his prime, I believe he was something like 75-5. And he had beaten everyone from middleweight to heavyweight and had only won the heavyweight title. Although in today's standards, he would be undisputed middleweight, super middleweight, light heavyweight, cruiserweight, and heavyweight champion. That's how you have to compare it. And in doing so, he beat over around a dozen Hall of Famers. Guys like Archie Moore 4 times. It's unbelievable. Which then, again, takes me through the guys that jump weight divisions to maybe the most impressive run of title, holding titles boxing's ever seen. And it's Henry Armstrong, who, in my opinion, is the second greatest fighter of all time, only behind Sugar Ray Robinson. And in the 30s, in his pomp, he was a 3-division champion, which you might listen to that now and think, well, there's loads of 3-division champions. Guys like Adrian Broner are 4-division champions. But in the time he was fighting, there were only 8 weight divisions. So he was nearly champion across half of those divisions. He was a featherweight champion, a lightweight champion, and a welterweight champion. So it's nearly a 20-pound jump there. But what makes it more impressive is that he held all of those titles simultaneously. So he was holding almost half of the sport's titles at the same time. He was fighting some of the greatest fighters ever. He never took a backward step. And he made 19 successful defenses of the welterweight title in that time, which is still nearly a century later a record. He then moved up to middleweight to box the middleweight champion Seferino Garcia. Ironically, Filipinos' biggest ever the Philippines' biggest ever champion physically. And he'd beaten Garcia before, but was robbed he had beaten Garcia before at welterweight. And he clearly beat Garcia for the middleweight title, but was robbed. So he would have been a four-division simultaneous champion in the 8-belt era, in the 8-division era. Now, to put that in today's context, it would be going from featherweight to middleweight, winning all of those titles, which is 7 weight divisions, but doing it all at the same time, holding 7 division titles all at the same time, consecutively fighting across them. It would be like Pacquiao, who was an 8-division champion, of course, going up and down those 8 weight divisions and winning those titles, but keeping hold of them, defending them, fighting at the welterweight limit and then the lightweight limit. It's crazy, freakish. The only man to ever do it. No one will ever do that again. You know, maybe they will be a simultaneous 3-division champion, but there's so many little gaps in between now. He was doing 12-pound jumps, 135 pounds to 147 pounds, 126 pounds to 135 pounds, 147 pounds to 160 pounds. It's crazy, crazy stuff, and one of the greatest achievements ever. You also have one of the most impressive feats of toughness ever is Jack Britton, one of the great welterweight champions of the 1910s. And his achievement, after being stopped in just his 3rd professional fight, is he would never be stopped again in 342 fights as a pro. 342 fights without getting knocked out is pretty serious stuff, especially considering many of those were 10-rounders and 15-rounders. He fought the likes of the great Benny Leonard, a top 15 all-time great, one of the greatest lightweights ever. He would fight Ted Kid Lewis, a British great fighter who had hundreds of fights. The level of competition was seriously high, and to not get stopped in that many fights, in a brutal era of boxing as well, you know, where he was fighting, 10 rounds most of the time. Britton is considered one of the greatest welterweights still, well over 110 years later. He's still considered in the top 20 welterweights ever for his impact there. An unbelievable achievement. The toughness of these guys in the old era, it's on another level. Which then, it moves me on to Harry Greb and his undefeated streak of 45-0, which, you might look at Floyd Mayweather and be like, Floyd Mayweather went 50-0. Marciano went 49-0. Larry Holmes 48-0. Calzaghe 46-0. But Harry Greb did all of this in 1 year. He went 45-0 across 12 months. 2 of those months, he was inactive because of broken hands and the flu. And he boxed from middleweight to heavyweight, defeating so many top-level fighters. It's the most legendary unbeaten streak in history. The names that follow are only Hall of Famers that Greb beat within those 12 months. He beat the heavyweight Bill Brennan 4 times, the middleweight world champion Jeff Smith, the Hall of Fame legendary battling Levinsky 4 times, Leo Hawke 3 times, another heavyweight in Billy Misk, Mike Gibbons, a great middleweight, Mike McTeague, and another heavyweight in George K.O. Brown. All of those guys either Hall of Famers or world champions around the time. I believe he actually went 52-0 after that before losing to Mike Gibbons, and then went 56 more fights unbeaten around 2 years and beat the great Gene Tunney in that streak, who was still to this day one of the greatest heavyweights ever. To put that into context, Greb was a middleweight. He was beating all of those guys in such a crazy amount of time across all those weight divisions, and he was severely injured throughout most of it as well and completely blind in one eye. Greb may well be the greatest fighter ever. He has the most wins against Hall of Famers ever, and he's defeated more Hall of Famers than anyone else in history. Which then takes me to my final 2. And Joe Louis's 27 consecutive heavyweight world title fights and his unbeaten 12-year streak it's unmatched, and it will never be matched again because of the activity. He went, I believe it was even longer than 12 years. It was 12 years active, I believe, but I don't believe he lost to Ezra Charles 14 years after losing to Max Schmeling. He was beating top fighters. I believe he went 26-0, or 27-0, sorry. No, 26-0 with 24 knockouts off the top of my head in his heavyweight run. 27-0 with 24 knockouts in his heavyweight run. I've just had a look at the notes there. He was consistently defending his titles and compiled the most iconic and dominant reign ever in heavyweight history. He had the biggest fight in boxing history in that time against Max Schmeling. And the reason it was the biggest fight ever is because Schmeling was a German. Lewis was American. It was 1938, I believe, right on the eve of World War II, with the whole world the tensions of the whole world viewed on the fight, brewing for the Second World War. And Schmeling was the only man to ever defeat him. He had knocked Joe Louis out previously. So Louis had the whole weight of the world on his shoulders. America against Germany. The propaganda machines of the two countries pumping into this fight. The only man to ever knock him out. And Louis went out and blasted him in a round. Such is the coolness of the great Joe Louis. One of the classiest, greatest fighters of all time. If you just look at his style, he was perfect. The amount of brutal knockouts he had in that reign, it really is one of the most iconic runs ever. Which takes me to my last point, and it's the greatest primes ever. It's not necessarily a moment, but I think we have to give a shout out to Sugar Ray Robinson's prime. Going unbeaten across 91 fights and losing just once in 131 fights. I think we could also give Willie Pep a mention here, but the level of competition Robinson was fighting. He only lost to Jake LaMotta in that run, and he defeated LaMotta 4 more times in that run, just to prove the point. He beat the great Kid Gavilan, one of the great welterweights of the time, a man who was never stopped in 140-odd fights. Henry Armstrong, Sammy Angot, the man who beat Willie Pep. He dominated as a welterweight, was one of the most vicious, fastest and skillful fighters ever in that time, and then moved up to middleweight to clear that Division 2 for a few years. He was super tough. He was stopped once in 200-plus fights after this at light heavyweight, solely due to heat exhaustion. And in his prime, it's just unbelievable. 91 fights unbeaten. He had 80-plus knockouts in that 130-fight streak. It's crazy. And one that goes under the radar for me is Roberto Duran, who, he's most well known for his run at, welterweight and middleweight in the 80s. But from 1970 to 1980, his prime was arguably, behind Sugar Ray Robinson's, the best ever. He beat the great featherweight champion Ernesto Marcel, another featherweight in Hiroshi Kobayashi. In 1970, as a teenager, he then beat the great Ken Buchanan to become lightweight champion at just 21. Would only lose to Esteban de Jesus, but defeat de Jesus 2 more times. Defeat top fighters like Adolfo and Edwin Verrouet, who were top fighters. They weren't champions because Duran was champion. He would just blitz the entire lightweight division for 7 years and then move up to beat Carlos Palomino, the former great welterweight champion. And then, of course, Sugar Ray Leonard in his prime, who was one of the greatest fighters ever, compiling a record of 72-1 across the decade, having over 50 fights and losing just once. And it's one of the greatest primes I've ever seen, and just behind Sugar Ray Robinson, in my opinion. But that is enough for today. That is my video. There's a lot of information crammed into there. But if you do like the information and the videos, please feel free to subscribe to the YouTube and support the Spotify. I do really appreciate it. And if you like this stuff, make sure you comment and let me know what you want to see in the future. And thank you.